Hi, I'm Nikhil Kamkolkar. I'm a writer filmmaker and an Unreal Engine artist. As a filmmaker, I'm always chasing truthful moments where every element of the mise en scène, whether it's lighting, camera movement, or color, or performance, works in unison to tell the same story and contribute to the emotional tone. This course is focused on cinematic lighting in Unreal Engine, along with the post processing and rendering techniques needed to deliver your work at the highest lighting fidelity. We'll be working with pre built shots from one of my films created entirely in Unreal Engine. The animation, cameras, and layout are already in place, so we can focus purely on building the look. I'll begin with no lighting at all and build the shot layer by layer. I'll share my complete lighting workflow in Unreal from script to a final high quality render, ready for the grading suite. And along the way, I'll endeavor to help you understand the principles, concepts, and Unreal features that are key to this workflow. If some of the terms feel unfamiliar to you, don't worry. This course is a guided journey that will take you step by step into a mastery you can apply to your own projects. Everyone learns differently. Let me share my method, and maybe it'll work for some of you. I first go through the entire course at a fast speed, not taking notes, not trying to comprehend everything, just listening. It helps me get familiar with the world of the course. Then I dive in a second time, and this time I skip to areas that pique my curiosity. And the third time is when I go from start to finish, working through every section, supplementing my learning with documentation and exploration. You'll find the way that works best for you. Next, let's take a look at the course structure so you can get a sense of everything we cover in this course and my approach in teaching it. This course is structured across 4 parts, each building on the last. So by the end, you'll not only understand how to light cinematically in Unreal Engine, but how to evaluate and deliver your work at the highest quality, ready for grading. Part 1 lays the foundation. We'll build a natural lighting system using directional light, sky atmosphere, skylight, exponential height fog and volumetric clouds, and the post-process volume. You'll also learn how to evaluate your lighting using lumen and path tracer and why both matter. Part 2 is all about practical lights and modifiers. We'll bring in spot, point, and rec lights, use emissives, light functions, bounce guards, negative fill, and explore cinematic enhancements like light shafts and post effects. Part 3 dives into advanced lighting and emotional storytelling. We'll analyze the scene, look at how time of day and script beats affect our lighting choices, work with multiple post-process volumes, and use Unreal's visualizers to debug and refine our lighting. And finally, Part 4 covers high-end rendering and color workflows. We'll set up OCIO, figure out when we can use LUTs and when we shouldn't, understand color spaces and the ACES workflow, render with the path tracer using Movie Render Queue and export EXRs, and do a basic grade in DaVinci Resolve. So we can understand this workflow end to end and deliver a polished cinematic shot. To get the most out of this course, you should be comfortable navigating Unreal Engine. We'll be using Unreal Engine 5.6 Preview, but everything shown will also work in version 5.5. Where there are UI differences, I'll call them out. If you worked on film sets, now you may make some connections, and I will be sure to highlight, a few relevant things that come up. But on-set experience is not a requirement for this course. All right, let's dive in. Now, in traditional filmmaking, the director of photography walks through the set or the location, observes what light already is available, and then, in collaboration with the director and department heads like the production designer, figures out the shots that they need and then builds the lighting plan from there. And they work from figuring out the large light sources to the small. In Unreal, we have the environment light mixer, a unified interface that manages the foundational components of your lighting and atmospheric setup. So you go to Window and Environment Light Mixer. And here you can see the skylight, directional light, sky atmosphere, volumetric cloud, and you can also select the amount of detail that is shown for every single light and atmospheric component. You can also add these from the Place Actors menu. So you can go to your lights where you'll see a directional light and all the other lights that are there in Unreal. We'll take a look at those later. And also in visual effects where you'll see your sky atmosphere, your volumetric cloud, your exponential height fog, and we'll also be talking about the post-process volume. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to add all of these with their default values. So let's start with the directional light, and you can see the scene start to build out in the viewport. Then we have our sky atmosphere, our skylight, our volumetric clouds. And if I go around the world right now, you can see what's going on here. Now, I've set up a big bounce card here. We'll talk about that in a bit. This is sort of the default setup that you can get by simply selecting the lights from the environment light mixer. At an ASC virtual production masterclass I took a while back, that's the American Society of Cinematographers, a director of photography shared something that stuck with me. Never start lighting without first seeing what light is already in the space and what you can remove. And then work from the largest sources of light to the small. Now, in a daylight scene, the largest source of light is the sun. In Unreal, that's the directional light. Now, directional light simulates sunlight as we experience it on Earth. It shares two key properties with real-world sunlight. One, parallel rays. The light arrives on Earth as parallel rays traveling in straight uniform lines, which cast sharp, hard-edged shadows. And there is no fall-off at distance. Now, light has a fundamental property that the intensity of the light falls or drops with distance. But with sunlight, it's the same intensity all across Earth, whether it's close to you or whether it's on a mountain 100 miles away. The intensity of the light received is the same. Why is that? Now, the sun may be massive, but it's also nearly 93 million miles away from Earth. It appears as a tiny circle in the sky, subtending just about 0.5 degrees. That small angle means that the rays reaching Earth are effectively parallel, and parallel rays give us crisp, well-defined shadows. The same logic applies to the moon. Though much closer, about 240,000 miles away, it still appears roughly the same size in our sky, again around 0.5 degrees. So the reflected sunlight that reaches us from the moon also arrives in parallel lines. That's why moonlight casts shadow just as sharp as sunlight, although they may be dimmer. The difference is intensity. And because both the sun and the moon are so far away, the drop-off in intensity across Earth's surface is negligible. The directional light has no physical origin point. It is treated as being infinitely far away. Its light rays are parallel, and it casts even, consistent light across the scene. This makes it perfect for natural daylight, whether you're building vast landscapes or lighting interiors with sunlight streaming through a window frame. And when I say infinitely far away, that's just math, right? The engine applies light uniformly across the scene based on the direction vector, not the position. All you have to remember is that directional light equals sunlight, parallel, distant, and evenly distributed. The directional light can also be used for the moon, right, which is just reflected sunlight. But the qualities are the same: parallel, even distribution of illumination and intensity, and crisp shadows. So the first thing I'm going to do is turn off some of these elements that we've added. So all I've got right now in my scene here is the directional light. You have the sunlight falling on the landscape, but the sky is black. In fact, if you were to stand on the surface of the moon, or if Earth didn't have an atmosphere, this is exactly what it would look like. Just the void of space, although the sunlight would fall on the landscape. Now, to see what the sky atmosphere actually gives us, I'm going to go ahead and turn that on. And right away you see that the light now has the atmosphere to go through and scatter. And that is really the big thing that the sky atmosphere gives us, is scattering. There's a very important thing that needs to be done to connect up our directional light with our sky atmosphere. So if I go to the directional light and I search for atmosphere sunlight, you can see the tooltip. It says whether the directional light can interact with the atmosphere, cloud, and generate a visual disk, all of which compose the visual sky. I'm going to turn this off. And when I do that, you'll see that even though we've got the sky atmosphere added to the scene, the directional light that we have is not interacting with it. So this is just something to keep in mind. Sky atmosphere itself doesn't emit light. It only describes how light should scatter. And the only way you can activate it is by going to the directional lights details panel and enable atmosphere sunlight. So we've got the sun disk, we've got a sky dome, and we've got a gradient in the sky. And this is the scattering effect that makes the sun feel like it's part of our world and not just a bright light in black space. Now what about the skylight? The skylight gives us the ambient light fill. The sky atmosphere gives us beautiful scattering, but it doesn't actually bounce any light into the scene. It doesn't emit any light at all. That's the skylight's job. Now, let's go ahead and turn on our skylight. And note that the physical location of the skylight actor doesn't really matter, because the skylight actor samples the entire environment, not its position. So you'll see in the details panel, if I change the intensity, I can raise the level of the ambient light. You'll also notice that there's a real-time capture option there, and that's what we've selected right now. This ensures that the skylight updates automatically when the sky changes, which is important for time of day systems, and in our case, as we are evaluating our lighting changes. The skylight takes all of the light that's being scattered around in the atmosphere, gathers it up, and then bounces it back into the scene, raising the level of our ambient light. It fills in the shadowed areas, and it softens the contrast from our directional light. Now, we're going to leave all the settings at default again. So I'm going to reset the intensity scale. And the default value for that is 1. We're going to leave it on real-time capture. And we'll talk about these other settings later on. And so that's the skylight. Now let's talk about the exponential height fog. This is the environment actor that adds atmospheric depth. It stimulates how particles in the air, like haze, dust, humidity, all of those scatter light. From place actor, we can add the exponential height fog from the visual effects menu, or we can do it from the environment light mixer. Now the fog is thick, closer to the ground, and then fades with height. This is mimicking what happens on Earth. We turn this off and on, and you can look at the mountains in the distance. You can see that it fades it out a little bit. Now we'll leave the default settings as a neutral baseline. And if we wanted to simulate realistic interaction with light beams, we can optionally enable volumetric fog in the details panel. So if I go to the details for my exponential height fog
and I click volumetric fog. Now on a directional light, I have to go and turn on cast volumetric shadow, which is currently turned on. Okay. And this combination allows the fog to catch beams of light. On film sets, for example, DPs use haze or smoke for the same purpose. But in Unreal, you can toggle it on and off creatively and with precision. Exposure is all about how much light the camera allows through to form an image. In photography, this is controlled by three interdependent settings, often called the exposure triangle. The aperture, or f-stop, which is how wide the lens opens, so it controls how much light enters to form the image. The shutter speed, which is how long the sensor is exposed to light. The longer the shutter is open equals more light. ISO, which is the sensor's sensitivity to light. A higher ISO is higher sensitivity, so a brighter image. In Unreal Engine, these settings exist in the Cine Camera Actor, and exposure is also affected by auto exposure or eye adaptation, where Unreal automatically adjusts the exposure based on scene brightness. This is helpful in games, but not when you're judging your lighting setup. To view your lighting consistently and to be able to see how your decisions are impacting the look, we need to control how Unreal interprets exposure, and we certainly don't want it to make any compensation on our behalf. So we want to turn off auto exposure and we want to go to manual exposure. And to do that, we use the post-process volume. So you go to Place Actors, Volumes, and the post-process volume. And you'll see this yellow bounding box. This is going to define the bounds of the post-process volume, which means that any settings that you change will only apply to the area of your scene that's within this box. Now let's go to the detail section for the post-process volume and search for exposure. And you'll see a field called metering mode. So you'll have to check it so that you can change it and change it to manual. There's also the exposure compensation field underneath it. Hit the checkbox and change it to 0 because we don't want Unreal to do any compensation for us. Now remember that the yellow box defines the bounds of the post-process volume. So these settings that we just changed have no effect because there's really nothing within that box. So we want to make this affect the entire scene. And to do that, we enable infinite extent in the details panel for the post-process volume. So let's go ahead and search for infinite and just select it. Now the settings apply globally, and if your scene appears too dark after this step, that's expected, right? Because Unreal's default directional light is set to only 10 lux, which is much dimmer than real-world sunlight. And because Unreal is no longer adjusting the exposure compensation for us, everything is just really dark. Now to fix that, let's go to the details for the directional light and change the intensity to about 80,000. So real sunlight on Earth is roughly around 80 to 100,000 lux. And now we're back where we want to be. We have light in our scene, and Unreal is no longer doing any exposure compensation for us. Now, if we increase our light levels, the scene is going to be brighter. If we decrease the light level, the scene is going to be darker. And this is exactly what we want. So now we've added all of the elements of environmental lights and the atmospheric components, mostly at their default values. But how do I view the lighting? I'm using the editor viewport and Lumen for global illumination and reflections, but I intend to render using Path Tracer. Now I'm using the viewport. So what's happening in the viewport? Well, let's talk about how the viewport image is actually built out. Now, the things that affect the viewport image are direct lighting from all the light actors, like the directional light, the spotlight, rec lights, and the shadows are being handled by virtual shadow maps or ray trace shadows. There's also a global illumination system that is taking all of the light in the scene and then calculating how it all bounces around and gives you the ambient light levels. This comes from Lumen, which is a real-time global illumination system. It also handles reflections. Now, Lumen is real time because it uses some smart approximations to do all the calculations, which can be very, very complex. The other system, Path Tracer, is more accurate. It actually calculates light behavior as it happens in real life. And so it takes a longer time to figure out everything from the global illumination levels to the shadows to reflections and refraction. But it's accurate, and this is what I use to actually render out the final image. But I also use Lumen for doing quick reviews because it's real time. But let's talk about a couple of other systems that also affect the viewport image. Ambient occlusion, which is a soft darkening in the crevices. This is a separate system that Lumen approximates, but Path Tracer calculates. The post-process volume, which does, as we saw, exposure, and it can do a whole host of other things, is also affecting the viewport image. So let's talk about Lumen versus Path Tracer. Lumen is fast in real time because it is making some really smart approximations. Path Tracer is slower, but very accurate. And there will be some differences that will always exist visually. When you start talking about glass, translucency, or subtle global illumination differences, there will be visual variations between the image that Lumen produces and the one that a Path Tracer would produce. So what I do to compare lighting accurately is I use the lit view from the view mode, which gives us the Lumen result. And then I have another viewport that has the view mode set to Path Tracer. And that's where I preview final output. And I use both throughout the process. I don't rely on just one. So when working, I use Lumen for iteration and Path Tracer to validate and render. Now to compare the lighting, I use the lit view in one viewport, and that is essentially using Lumen underneath the covers. And I open a second viewport and I set that to Path Tracer. I sync the view in both viewports using bookmarks. So Control 1 in one viewport and go to the other one and hit 1 to get the same perspective. Now, because Path Tracer works differently under the hood, it's not going to match up with the image that's generated by Lumen. If Lumen is approximating the lighting and Path Tracer is doing it accurately, why not just work in Path Tracer from the start? Well, because it's slow. Take a look at this progress bar. It takes a long time for the Path Tracer to render just one frame. I can iterate way faster in Lumen and then switch to Path Tracer when I need the accuracy. And also, some complex materials won't work. For example, you may need to create a simpler water shader to get it to work in Path Tracer. Certain elements like landscape grass may not show up unless you set specific console variables. And once you're happy with your lighting, it's best to export a single EXR image and open it in DaVinci Resolve. You can use the free version, that's fine, and use the scopes and check for crushed blacks or clipped highlights, and also to make sure that you're happy with the way your lighting looks. Now we'll talk about what crushed blacks and clipped highlights are in the next section, where we'll jump into DaVinci Resolve and take a look at those. And then finally, you can go ahead and render using Path Tracer. Now, a quick note about the bounce board in my scene. Path Tracer sometimes underrepresents the ambient fill, especially of the skylight. That's why I use a bounce board. It acts like a reflector, bouncing light into the shadow areas that otherwise would feel too dark. If I toggle the bounce board off and on, you'll see how it fills in the back wall with a bit of extra light. This kind of hands-on control gives you more flexibility than relying entirely on environmental GI. We'll dive deeper into tools like the bounce board and negative fill in the advanced lighting section, but for now, just remember, don't be afraid to mix practical lighting with your environmental setup to get the results you want. And that wraps up part 1. We've built this foundation of our lighting system using directional light, sky atmosphere, skylight, exponential height fog, volumetric clouds, and the post-process volume to ensure that Unreal uses manual exposure. We also explored how Lumen and Path Tracer affect what we see and how we can evaluate lighting accurately. and how to reduce the visual discrepancies between Lumen and Path Tracer so that we can use Lumen for real-time previewing and Path Tracer for the final render. In part 2, we'll start shaping the mood more precisely, using practical lights like point, spot, and rec lights, emissive lights, bounce, and negative fill. We'll look at light functions, turn on the volumetric fog so we can get some God rays and light shafts happening. We'll also take a look at megalights and more post-process volume modifications like bloom and flares. All of this to help us craft a more emotionally charged look. It's really important to understand the emotional beats and understand the underlying story movement so that you can light not just for realism or for effect, but to guide the audience's feelings. Everything starts with the script. So does my lighting. Shadows are a critical part of making your lighting feel grounded and realistic. The way we shape and control them plays a huge role in emotional tone, depth, and visual cohesion. You'll often hear phrases like, the blacks are crushed, or the blacks feel too milky. Let's break down what that means and why that matters. So let's jump into DaVinci Resolve for a moment. Here's a shot from the short film, and we'll view it with the scopes turned on. Now in the waveform, the bottom part is where all the darker pixels are, and the topmost part is where all your highlights are, the brightest pixels in the image. Now we can use the lift, gamma, gain controls to modify either the shadows or the midtones or the highlights. So the lift controls the shadows, gamma is for the midtones, and gain is for the highlights. You lower the lift, and the shadows or the blacks deepen, because it doesn't have to be all shadows. It could just be black clothes, for example, right? And when the shadows hit 0, you lost the detail that was there, the texture, the things that were visible even in the darkness. All of that is lost. If you raise the shadows a little too much, so if you raise your lift a little too much, then you can see that your shadows become grayish. They move towards the midtones, and that's called milky blacks. A similar thing happens with the highlights as well. If you take your gain and you raise it, and your highlights hit the topmost value of the range, which is 1023 in this case, and beyond that, all of the detail within the highlights is lost. Now, this just isn't an aesthetic consideration. For example, in Unreal, if you crush the shadows or clip your highlights before you export, I cannot go into DaVinci Resolve and bring that detail back. It's gone forever. So you really want to be careful when you are exporting, A, to use a high quality export format like EXR, and B, to make sure that your lighting doesn't crush your shadows or clip your highlights. The way you can test for that is to export a test frame, an EXR file, just one frame of it, bring it into DaVinci Resolve. You can use the free version and check the scopes to analyze your image and adjust before committing to a full render, because that can take a long time when you use a renderer like the Path Tracer. Why does all of this matter? In virtual production, or when you're doing compositing between a live plate and a background plate, one of the fastest ways to break the illusion of all of that being one consistent world is inconsistent black levels between your live action and your CG or your LED screens. If the shadows don't match, if they're too dark, too lifted, or the wrong color, the audience senses something is off, even if they can't say why. So we monitor black levels, we protect shadow detail. That's what helps us keep the illusion alive. Now, I mentioned color in shadow, so let me just clarify that. Now, the black level or the shadow level is made up of RGB, right? So if you have more R and it doesn't match the level of the green and the blue, your shadow is going to be reddish in color. And that's what I mean by color, even when you're talking about black level.